All right, so today we're in the chapter on mastering the mind. And so we usually talk about the term training the mind, but that's what this is really about, is how do you go about actually doing that? And the Pali Canon, the primary way of going about doing that is the Eightfold Path. And you're just following the path and the different elements of that. It's talked about as if it is a sequence that you go through, but the Buddha really talks about it in a way that makes it more, well, when we use the wheel, and the wheel, the eight-spoke wheel, that those are the points around the eight-spoke wheel, and there's not a priority. They're all the same. And so basically we do them all at the same time, if you will. Pragmatically, that's not quite practical. There's elements of it that can be done that way, but other elements of it that can't really be done that way. But it's important to be just aware that it's not just a single step-by-step process that we go through. So within this, the first part is moral discipline. The first stage in terms of mastering the mind refers to moral discipline and the being conscious of behavior and moral restraint. He talks briefly about the monastic precepts called higher moral discipline, and moral discipline that is consistently observed, that infuses the mind with purifying force of moral virtue, generating joy and deeper confidence in the Dharma. So that gives a little bit of an overview of what moral discipline to him means, because sometimes the words have a slightly different meaning than what we would normally assume in the English language. So the second one then in the next paragraph is about meditation. So moral discipline or ethics, and then meditation is the second one. And so here it's to stabilize the mind, which is like shamatha, or focused attention on something, and clear away obstacles to allow the unfolding of wisdom. And so by clearing away the obstacles, that then opens the door to wisdom, which is the third training of the mind. And so here this is called training in the higher mind. It brings inner stillness and quietude, and is also called the development of serenity. And the results in deep concentration or mental unification, samadhi, also known as internal serenity of mind. So we have both of those elements going on here. What we usually refer to as shamatha, focused attention, and single-pointed calm abiding. So there's both the attention aspect and there's the calm abiding aspect as a part of that. And then there's also the element that is related to the wisdom, but that really gets into the third category here. And the other part of it that he refers to relating to right concentration are the four jhanas. Okay, and this is beyond that. Then we have the four formless attainments. So put together, we have the four jhanas, and then we have the four formless absorptions, is the word that I'm more familiar with here than attainments. So that together makes 8 levels. Now, when we talk about shamatha, usually we're talking about 2 types of shamatha. There's shamatha with signs and without signs. And these first 4 have shamatha with signs, and then the next one have the shamatha without signs. Those are the formless absorptions that are a part of this. Okay? Then the third stage, the wisdom stage, the third part of training the mind here, is training in higher wisdom, designated as direct insight into the true nature of things as disclosed by the Buddha's teaching. So it's not just ordinary kind of wisdom into things, but it's that more transcendent kind of wisdom that we're talking about, where we achieve a direct understanding, a direct experience of that. So when we get into some of the more detailed philosophical arguments in Mahayana and in Vajrayana, for example, these are the things that are considered ineffable. very difficult to try and explain in ordinary terms. We can use terms, but that can potentially be misleading. And so we have to be very careful about the way that we go about doing that. Okay, so that's an overview here. So then he goes into more detail with a brief summary of each of the actual texts. So the first of those is a short epigrams that are needed to cultivate mental or for mental cultivation, and these occur in pairs. So there are the dangers of the uncultivated mind as well as the benefits of the cultivated mind. So the uncultivated include things like greed, hatred, and delusion, as well as the various offshoots of those, the three poisons. And then the unwholesome karma, which bring painful results. And so those cause our suffering and bondage in the world, and the mental training is intended to help subdue those things, or ultimately uproot them so that they no longer affect us in that way. And then from development of the mind arises happiness, freedom, and peace, the more positive aspect of those. So in the second text then, he talks about the serenity, or shamatha, and insight, vipassana. And so here, it's when serenity is developed, it leads to concentration. So the serenity is the calm abiding, the concentration is the single-pointed focus. But then it goes beyond that then to the details where we begin to actually contemplate things, and that's where we get into the vipassana. So it's not just the single-pointed concentration, but then using that as a tool to help then go into a better understanding of the wisdom aspect. And that then results in our liberation from lust and ill will. When insight is developed then, that's the actual vipassana practice, it leads to insight into the true nature of phenomena. So the Buddha uses that term a lot, or translators perhaps use that term a lot in trying to explain this particular point, that is the key to understanding wisdom from a Buddhist point of view. The true understanding of the nature, understanding the true nature of phenomena. And this then permanently, not a word that's used a lot in Buddhism because we talk about impermanence all the time, but at this point it is said that we permanently liberate the mind from ignorance. So that means we attain enlightenment. And there is no end to enlightenment, so that's the reason that it is permanent. In the next text, also labeled 2, but 2. So 822 here. So here the aptitudes of meditators differ. So there are several sutras that talk about alternative approaches based on differences among individuals. And so here it talks about 4 particular approaches. The first one is the classical approach of developing serenity first and then insight afterwards. And that's the way that we almost always do it. The classic texts talk about that you have to do it that way or it's not going to work, and so forth. So serenity here is referring to the jhanas. And then it also, sometimes these are called access or threshold concentration. This is a state that kind of borders on those. There is actually in some of the lists that access concentration is number 1 in the list of jhanas. So that's the first thing you do. And then from that state you go through the standard 4 and then on up from that into the formless absorptions. The second approach listed here is insight first and serenity afterward. And so this one is said to work for people of very high intellectual faculties. And so here the concentration is not strong enough to allow breakthrough to the supramundane path. And so we return to the task of unifying the mind before resuming the work of insight. So it's kind of going back and forth, even though it says we do the vipassana first, we get the insight, and then we work on development, helping bring that together. And that culminates in the supramundane path. The supramundane being a term for the ultimate nature of things, or focusing on the ultimate nature of things, the true nature of phenomena, for example. The third approach at the bottom of the page there, we have serenity and insight in tandem. So that's the third approach. First we have serenity, then insight, then we have insight, then serenity, and here we have the two simultaneously. So here we first attain a particular level of concentration, such as a jhana or formless attainment, and then employ it as a basis for insight. Then we return to concentration, attain a different jhana or formless attainment, and then use that as the basis of insight. So we basically alternate back and forth. So we've got the 4 jhanas, and then we've got the 4 formless absorptions. So if we put that in order, and it pretty much has to be in order, especially when you look at the first 4, because there are things that are added into each one, but then those things leave in the next one or 2 up from that. And so it pretty much forces an order for that to happen. But we basically alternate. So we've got 8 things on one side, and we alternate with the vipassana, the insight, go back and forth between those until we've reached the highest state. The fourth one is somewhat obscure, he says. The sutra says that a monk's mind is seized by agitation about the teachings, and then sometime later he gains concentration and attains the supramundane path. So it's suggesting here some kind of an intense desire to understand the Dharma, but they can't focus clearly on any of the meditation objects. So later on, with certain supporting conditions, they're able to subdue the mind, gain concentration, and attain that. But it doesn't exactly explain how that's done. It just sort of happens. So then we go on to the third text there, so 8.2.3. And again, here we have both serenity and insight being necessary as the skills needed. And then the serenity requires a skill in steadying, composing, unifying, and concentrating the mind. Those are typical kinds of ways that we use for that type of activity. And then the insight requires skill in observing, investigating, and discerning conditioned phenomena and as formations. How do they come about being? And that's an important part of Vipassana in terms of understanding things. Things that are composed of different things have parts. If they have parts, then they're not ultimate. If they are impermanent, they are not ultimate. If they are interdependent or dependent upon other things, then they are not ultimate. Okay, so we have to be able to discern that. We have to be able to analyze things and figure out if they meet those criteria. So here then, the sutra confirms that some meditators begin by internal serenity of mind, others the higher wisdom of insight, others by developing both in tandem, and eventually they must all strike a healthy balance between serenity and insight. So regardless of which of the specific approaches that you use, eventually you have to all come together at the unification of those. And so the exact point of balance between the two will differ from one person to another. So even the end point isn't exactly the same in terms of those two components. So you might describe it as the middle way. Okay, it's not this extreme or that extreme, but it's somewhere in the middle. And again, that's not a mathematical average. That's a general region within that where there's some room for movement back and forth as a part of that. So then he mentions that to issue in the knowledge and vision of the Four Noble Truths, the world transcendent wisdom, this occurs in 4 distinct installments, the 4 stages of realization that destroy ignorance along with the defilements. And the main impediments are the 5 hindrances, which we've talked about previously. And so those prevent us from properly understanding our own good, and our initial efforts then of overcoming those hindrances, once these are overcome, success is said to be ensured or assured. So the 4th text here, 8:4, compares the stages of purification of the mind to refining gold. And so when a monk begins, things have various gross kinds of impurities that have to be removed from body, speech, and mind. And then by a more moral disciple and a vigilant introspection as a part of that. And then he eliminates the mid-level impurities of unwholesome thoughts and sensuality, ill will, harmfulness. Then the subtle impurities of meandering thoughts. And finally, we eliminate thoughts about even Dharma, the subtlest obstacle. So we transcend that. And in a way, that's a very Dzogchen kind of an approach to things, where you completely transcend the labels that we give to things and just have a direct abiding in that state. And so here we attain mental unification, the basis for the six direct knowledges culminating in arhatship. So then he goes on to say that sometimes these compare with the taming of a wild animal. So here we have a metaphor where the trainer has to use various techniques, and the meditator, in comparison, has to draw on various methods. And it is not enough just to use one particular technique. We must be skilled in a number of methods. So to use a metaphor, one of the ways we can think of that is it's a toolbox. It's like all of these different ways that we can do meditation, and we have them in our toolbox. And if number 1's not working, then go on to something else. If the pliers aren't working, they don't get a tight enough grip, use a wrench. Okay? So we look for what we think is the best application for us, as well as what it is we're trying to work on. And then if that doesn't work, then we look for another alternative. And there are any number of different alternatives that we can use. So we can't give up. We have to push forward and be patient and persistent in our efforts to make that happen. Then in text number 5, the Buddha explains 5 ancillary techniques that he calls signs. These are thoughts connected with lust, hatred, and delusion. The Sutras teach various techniques of meditation aimed at inducing concentration. There are specific meditation subjects against the unwholesome mental states that they are intended to rectify. So in some cases, there are very specific practices. If you've got one particular issue, then there are sometimes practices that are specific to that. There are also some that are fairly generic and applied to all kinds of obscurations. And usually those will work, but not always. So sometimes we need something that's a little bit more specific to deal with those. And so here he talks about the unattractive nature of the body. Now this tends to be a very path of individual liberation approach. Sometimes that path is known as the path of renunciation, and that's a very clear example here of that particular approach. And so using the gender-biased view of this, talking about the lust for a woman. And so we look at the body of a woman in this way that really doesn't look very attractive. Okay? And so that kind of builds up over time this idea that that's really not something you want to do, so you don't want this attraction to women. Now, it would be easy to flip that around to do the same thing for a man, but the text is written in this somewhat misogynist way here. So anyway, this one starts off with the remedy for sensual lust is loving kindness. is, or excuse me, the meditation on the unattractive nature of the body is the solution for sensual lust. Then loving kindness is the solution for ill will. Mindfulness of breathing for restlessness. The perception of impermanence for conceit. The idea of I am. And the focus on me and mine and all those things. So those are some examples of practices that are targeted towards specific kinds of issues. Then below that, it talks about the four divine abodes, or immeasurable states. So these are the four immeasurables that we're familiar with. And so these are antidotes to ill will, harmfulness, discontent, and partiality. So the four immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. So those get applied in that order there. Continuing on 261, then, we also have the divine abodes as a basis for merit. And here it gives the simile of the saw, which shows loving kindness in action. And then among the lay Buddhists, there are the 6 recollections of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, morality, generosity, and the devas, the gods. It appears that in these texts, oftentimes for lay practitioners, the goal may not be enlightenment, but attaining the state of a god. Now in Vajrayana, that's not necessarily a good thing, because the gods are often described as, at the end of their life, going straight down to the lowest karma that you have. But in here, it's presented in a little different way, that when you go to the god realm, you probably don't have any of that really negative karma left. So if the only thing you have left is some good karma that needs to be addressed, you might go to a god realm. When you burn that off for the life of the god realm, then you go on to enlightenment. Okay? So it gives a little bit different kind of a presentation than we often see in Vajrayana. So in text number 7 then, the themes are close to the hearts of everyday experiences of people living household lives. So these are particularly related to people like us. And those enrich and uplift their lives, bring them closer to spiritual contact with the ideals of a religious faith. And the first 3 are primarily devotional recollections that build upon confidence in the 3 jewels: Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And then we begin with faith and cleanse the mind of defilements and conduce to sustained concentration. Then meditation on moral discipline develops one's observance of the precepts. And then recollection of generosity builds upon our practice of giving and altruism. And then recollection of the devas is a contemplation on the fruits of one's faith, morality, generosity, and wisdom as they mature in future lives. So the next one is the discourse related to the most comprehensive of all of the instructions on meditation. So this comes from the Satipatthana Sutra, which is in 2 different versions he describes here. There's a long and a middle length version here in 2 different of the Nyikayas. And so the former, the long one, differs only by the extended analysis of the Four Noble Truths, which may have originally been an early commentary. And then the middle length version, which is included here as text 8.8, we have this devoted to this system of meditation. So it's a fairly detailed description of all of the aspects of this. The Satipatthana Sutta does not recommend a single meditation subject, nor even a single method. It explains how to establish the mode of contemplation needed to arrive at realization of nirvana, and the appropriate frame of mind also needed for that. This is called the establishment of mindfulness. And so there are whole books out there on these 4 establishments of mindfulness. So these can be understood as a compound of sati, mindfulness, and upatana, establishment. So those two are put together in that way. Continuing on page 262 at the top here. According to the standard formula, a satipatthana is a mode of dwelling and it involves observation of objects in the proper frame of mind. Frame of mind then consists of three positive qualities: energy, mindfulness, and clear comprehension. Sati originally meant memory, but in the present context, recollection of the present, being present during the meditation. It's a sustained awareness of what is happening to us right now and within us on each occasion of experience. So we have experiences, so we're aware not only of things outside, but also inside. What is going on? So that's one of the first stages of mindfulness. So mindfulness in its initial stages is concerned with keeping the contemplative mind continually on its object. So just being able to stay focused, the attention on that object, which means continually present to the mind. So when we start off like with a small object of some kind and we decide to focus on that, we set it there, and we don't want our mind to wander off to the grocery list or some other object. We want to stay focused on that particular thing, and we want to be able to recognize as soon as it does tend to go off a little bit and bring it right back. Now, in some methods, they will tell you to label that, okay, my mind's wandering, and then go back. I tend to disagree with that because of research on the brain. If you do that, what you're doing is you're creating a pathway, a neural pathway in your brain for the mind to wander, which is not what you want. You want your mind to refocus. So I think that a better approach is don't go there, don't go to a label that's outside of what you're trying to do, but just refocus your mind. Okay? Wanders, just refocus your mind. And don't even think about anything else. Anyway, personal opinion there. Mindfulness prevents the mind from slipping away, from drifting off, wandering into forgetfulness, and so forth. Mindfulness is often said to occur in close connection with clear comprehension, a clear knowledge and understanding of what one is experiencing. So a lot of times in our tradition we talk about mindfulness and awareness. So those are the two things that it's talking about here. So using my hand puppets, if you'll allow me to again. So the first one is mindfulness. That's the one focused on the object. And the second one is awareness, paying attention to whether we are focused. And so as soon as this one starts to drift, this one says, hey, wait, get back. And so that's basically what we're trying to do. Mindfulness and awareness. Now, it's important to be aware that some texts reverse those two terms. They're really synonyms for each other. But when they reverse it, they use awareness as the first one and mindfulness as the second one. They're still talking about the same thing. It's just that the terms get reversed. So I say that so that if you run across that in a text somewhere, you pay attention to, be mindful of, which way they're using the terminology, because otherwise it can become a little bit confusing there as a part of that. So continuing on in the next paragraph then, one engages in this after having subdued longing and dejection in regard to the world. So our first task is letting go of our attachment to things in worldly life. And then according to the commentary, signify greed and aversion, and thus represent the 5 hindrances, which we'll get to a little bit later, before one can start to actually practice these 4 levels of the jhanas and so forth. So the practice is itself a means to overcoming longing and dejection. So it's actually embedded within the practices, especially the earlier stages. And then subduing the obstructive influences of greed and aversion, the meditator arouses the positive qualities of energy, mindfulness, and clear comprehension, and then contemplates four objective domains: the body, feelings, states of mind, and phenomena. So those become integrated with the others. So all of a sudden we've gone from 4 stages, let's say, at the jhanas, to a matrix that has 4 columns to the 4 stages, okay? The body, feelings, states of mind, and phenomena. So each of those gets applied to each of the jhanas. Okay, so we've got a 4x4 matrix now, if you will. And then if you add the formless absorptions up above that, those would go on. But I don't think that he actually goes into those stages. So these 4 domains differentiate mindful observation into the 4 establishments of mindfulness, which are detailed a little more down below here. But before we get that, there's another paragraph here. So the Satipatthana Sutra has the 4 main sections. 2 of the sections, the first and the fourth, have several subdivisions. And then altogether, this forms 21 meditation subjects. And several of these can be used as means to develop serenity, the shamatha. But the Satipatthana system as a whole seems especially designed for the development of insight. And that's because it involves a significant amount of actual contemplation as a part of that. Now, I don't know for sure. I've done some reading about the development of this in the Theravada tradition, but it appears that I do know that this particular sutra is one of the main sutras that they use in terms of guidance for meditation. And a couple of hundred years ago, in Burma, there was a shift over to more emphasis on the vipassana than the shamatha. And I suspect that this played a key role in that they saw that, and they saw that the emphasis was that, and they were trying to develop practices that were more applicable for the lay practitioners. And so I suspect this is probably the primary source that led to that. And then, because Buddhism had been suppressed then in Sri Lanka and in Laos and so forth, that they borrowed that back from Burma and recreated a new form of Theravada in all of those areas. So what we call Theravada today is not really like the Theravada that the original forms of Theravada that came to Sri Lanka in the very beginning. Anyway, we go then through these 4 parts here. The contemplation of the body. So this comprises of 14 subjects: mindfulness of breathing, the 4 postures, the clear comprehension of activities, the unattractive nature of the body by looking at organs and tissues and so forth, the elements, the various elements, the 9 charnel ground contemplations, as well as corpses in different stages of decomposition. Okay, so those are the 14 parts, just a list of collections of those. Then the second one is the contemplation of feeling. So we have 3 primary types: pleasant, painful, and neither painful or pleasant. And then we have further distinguished into carnal and spiritual feelings. Okay, so carnal being ordinary, everyday kinds of things, and spiritual ones being based on the elevation of our practices in that regard. So these are considered as one subject. Even though there's 2 topics there, it's all considered as one subject. Then the third one is the contemplation of the mind. And again, this is one subject, although it's differentiated into 8 pairs of contrasting states of mind. So there's subcategories within that. Then we have, the last one is the contemplation of phenomena. So here we have 5 different categories that are governed by the Buddhist teaching, the Dharma, and that has a dual meaning. Dharma meaning phenomena that is contemplated by way of the Dharma as the teaching. So Dharma in Buddhism has both of those meanings. Sometimes it means phenomena, sometimes it means the teaching. So again, you have to pay attention to how it's being used so that you can differentiate what the meaning is when they use that word. Now a lot of times, in my experience, if they use Dharma, they're more likely to be talking about the teachings. If they're talking about phenomena, they use that word, phenomena, instead of confusing things by using the same word for two different meanings. So then the 5 categories are the 5 hindrances, the 5 aggregates, the 6 internal and external sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the 4 noble truths. So lots and lots of categories here. So you can see why this takes forever in the Theravada tradition to attain enlightenment. There are so many levels that you have to go through as a part of that. And Mahayana and in Vajrayana, you don't go through nearly that many different levels. We do have some levels, but not nearly that many as a specific. We have lots of practices, but you go through only major levels, and then within that you can go more this way or more that way or whatever to achieve within that particular level. So then below the enumeration there of those 4 types, he says that a progressive sequence seems to be implied here. Mindfulness of breathing, one moves to subtler levels of quiescence or calmness. In contemplation of feeling, one moves toward non-carnal feelings that are neither painful nor pleasant. In contemplation of mind, one moves toward states of mind that are concentrated and liberated. These all suggest that progressive contemplation brings enhanced concentration. In the contemplation of phenomena, the emphasis shifts toward insight. One begins by observing and overcoming the 5 hindrances, and then the hindrances mark succession in concentration, or overcoming the hindrances mark success in concentration. With the concentrated mind, one contemplates the 5 aggregates and the 6 sense bases. As contemplation gains momentum, then the 7 factors of enlightenment become manifest. And the development of the 7 enlightenment factors culminates in the knowledge of the 4 noble truths. So there is a sequence that makes sense to these. So even though at certain places we've got a bit of a matrix going on, they've restructured them within the tradition to say, well, this one kind of leads to that one, this one leads to that one, and so forth. It becomes a little bit more linear in nature, which for most of us makes it a little bit easier to try and follow. The knowledge of the 4 noble truths then liberates the mind from the defilements and thus leads to the attainment of nirvana. So each of these major contemplation exercises is supplemented by an auxiliary section. Oh, you thought you were done. Not quite. Okay. And so the first one, well, he calls it a refrain with 4 subdivisions. So these are actually applied to each of the other previous categories, like each of the 4 jhanas. So this is part of what creates that subdivision and the matrix effect. So the first one is that the meditator contemplates the object internally within his or her own experience, externally reflecting on the experience of others, and both, ensuring some kind of a balanced view of the two. The second one is the meditator contemplates the object as the subject to origination and vanishing, or both. And then this brings the characteristic of impermanence. So things come and go, they arrive, they vanish, that's impermanent. And suffering and non-self are all a part of that as well. Then the third state is that the meditator is simply aware of the bare object to the extent necessary for constant mindfulness and knowledge. So there we're getting to the state where things are really beginning to be stabilized. We observe them in that state and we don't wander off here or there, at least not very often, and so forth. And then the fourth one describes the meditator as dwelling in a state of complete detachment, not clinging to anything at all in the world. So this is a classical shamatha type of point of view. Now, in our tradition, we talk a lot, coming from the Mahayana, about other kind of stages, if you will. One of the more simple ones that's easy for people to grasp is a metaphor in which in the beginning, when you're trying to learn to do shamatha practice, it's like a waterfall coming off a cliff, okay? It's not stopping, it's going all the time. Your mind is constantly going. And then it's like going down a stream. There may be some moments of clarity, it's bouncing off rocks and so forth on its way down the hillside, but there are at least these moments of clarity. And then it goes on more into a river, where most of the time it's fairly steady, but there are rapids here and there. And then eventually we get to a lake where everything is very smooth and steady. Now occasionally they add a fifth one, which is it's like a mountain, because at least there's some little ripples sometimes in a lake. But in the mountain, it doesn't appear to be moving ever. It does, but it doesn't appear to be. So it's very, very solid. Or there's also the 10 stages of shamatha, which go through a more detailed version of that and getting to that state of complete stability. The goal, though, is basically the same as what we're looking at here, with one difference. And that is, in our tradition, we tend to separate shamatha from vipassana more clearly than what they do here. Here they tend to integrate the two more, or bounce back and forth between the two and so forth. So that's one of the differences in how those are done. Then also we talk about the mindfulness of breathing. Now, mindfulness of breathing is often the first form of meditation that is taught. So we just that becomes the object of focus, is the breath. The breath is with us all the time. It's fairly convenient. It's a fairly easy thing to focus on. Now, some people throw in a few other things that I don't particularly think are helpful, but maybe they are. Counting, for example. To me, counting is a distraction, but that's me. So they may have you count your breath. Just count the out-breaths to 10, for example, and then start over again. Count the out-breaths to 10. That may help provide some initial focus for people, but to me it's just one more distraction, and just focus on what's actually going on, which is the breathing part, I think is more effective. But if the other one works, that's fine too. So here, it's included as one meditation among a bunch of others, but the Nyikayas also assign it to a position of very fundamental importance as a part of that. The Buddha has said that he used mindfulness of breathing as his main meditation, subject to the attainment of enlightenment. So that was a very important one for the Buddha. So he's emphasizing that this is something that can be very beneficial to us in that process. During his teaching career, he occasionally went in seclusion and devoted himself to concentration gained through mindfulness of breathing. So then, mindfulness of breathing, there's an entire chapter on that, whereas the Satipatthana Sutra explains it as a simple 4-step formula. The sutras in this collection expanded into 16 steps, but they're still really considered to be 4 steps with some kind of subtle nuances within those. And so also from the Anapana Samyutta describes the 16 steps, so it gives a more detail as a part of that. And they're not necessarily sequential in that they partially overlap with each other, so it's not completely sequential. So here it says that these 4 intermediate steps at each level act more like facets rather than actual steps in the process. So there are 4 tetrads, each of which corresponds to one of the 4 establishments of mindfulness. The first has the 4 facets mentioned in the Satipatthana Sutta and on contemplation of the body. The others extend the practice to contemplations of feelings, mind, and phenomena. So mindfulness of breathing can fulfill not just one, but all four establishments of mindfulness. So that's one of the reasons that it's important. It's a somewhat more simple way of approaching all of this. And then in turn, we can fulfill the 7 factors of enlightenment. And then in turn, we fulfill the true knowledge and liberation. So this shows that mindfulness of breathing to be a complete subject of meditation that brings with simple attention to the breath and culminates in the permanent liberation of the mind. And then finally, in the last sutra in this chapter's collection, Venerable Shariputra testifies to his own achievement of mastery over the mind. Here he gets some questions from Venerable Ananda, and he explains how he was able to dwell for a whole day in each of the jhanas and formless attainments, as well as in the special attainment called the cessation of perception and feeling. So doing that without grasping to these attainments with thoughts like I and me. Okay, so that's the chapter that we're looking at here today. So we'll take a short little break.